Michelle Rivera looked around the lobby of the glittering Las Palmas Hotel in Manila, the capital city of the Philippines. It was 10 p.m. on the evening of Monday, June 4th, 1990, and the beautiful young woman with long black hair was about to have her first ever face-to-face meeting with her future husband, who had just arrived from America. Looking up at her father, who was standing next to her, Michelle squeezed her dad's arm even tighter as she tried to control her excitement and also her nerves. If everything went well, and Michelle prayed that it would, then very soon she might be spending her honeymoon in one of the fancy suites somewhere inside this glamorous and expensive 23-story hotel. But all that depended on what happened over the next few hours. Michelle knew that her father, a carpenter from their tiny village located far away from this grand hotel, had serious doubts about how his daughter had met up with the man they were about to meet here in this lobby. But Michelle was sure that once her whole family got to know Jonathan Nice, it wouldn't matter that she and the successful scientist from North Carolina had met through what was basically a mail-order bride catalog. As Michelle had kept telling both her parents, in the 11 months since Jonathan had first seen Michelle's picture and answered her ad in the Lonely Hearts section of the Manila Times newspaper, the practical reasons they had for placing and responding to that ad had soon been replaced by genuine feelings of love and compatibility. And after almost 1 year of exchanging letters, cards, and gifts through the mail, the marriage proposal that Michelle had received from Jonathan just 4 months into their correspondence now seemed like the answer to both their prayers. For 34-year-old Jonathan, the long-distance courtship had offered the once-divorced and socially awkward scientist the chance to find a wife without really leaving his lab or taking valuable time away from his current research. That research focused on finding a revolutionary cure for asthma, a lung disease that causes episodes of wheezing and breathlessness. And when Jonathan's Filipino coworker had shown Jonathan Michelle's picture in the Manila Times, right away, Jonathan was struck by her youth and beauty. And as soon as Michelle answered Jonathan's first few letters, Jonathan was sure he had found the person he was looking for. A gorgeous partner who was willing to give him a family, be a stay-at-home mom, and focus her attention exclusively on caring for him and their kids. For Michelle, the educational, financial, and cultural roadblocks she had faced ever since graduating from high school had eventually convinced her that marrying a successful American might be her best bet for moving up in the world. So far, her attempts to make that happen on her own had failed. At the age of 16, armed with an outstanding academic record, Michelle had left the Rivera family's bamboo house perched on stilts over the water to attend the National College of Business Administration in the bustling and exciting city of Quezon, 6 hours to the south. But less than 1 year later, Michelle's father could no longer afford the tuition. And so, at the age of 17, Michelle set aside her dream of a professional career and found employment in a city closer to her hometown. Living with her aunt, Michelle would spend the next few years working at a dress shop near the U.S. Naval Base in Subic Bay. The American servicemen and women and their families who lived on and near the base seemed rich compared to the average Filipino, and it wasn't long before Michelle had joined hundreds of other young Filipino women in dreaming of finding an American husband who might take her to the United States. And one way to make that connection was to sign on with Manila's pen pal agencies that promised to find Michelle new male friends in America. And by the time Michelle and Jonathan had begun their correspondence, Michelle, who had very little experience in the world, was captivated by the life she imagined she would have with Jonathan. Her one concern, the fact that he was 12 years older than she was, had evaporated when Jonathan had sent her a picture of himself that showed a tall, fit, and handsome man with thick blonde hair, blue eyes, and a warm smile. He looked every part the former athlete who had played basketball back in college, and who had taken very good care of himself ever since. Michelle had spent the past year looking at that photograph, and she had no doubt that in addition to the emotional connection she and Jonathan had made in exchanging heartfelt letters with each other, as soon as they actually laid eyes on each other, they would feel an instant physical attraction too. Now, Michelle could feel her heart beat faster every time the elevator stopped in the lobby. But when the man Michelle had been waiting for finally did step out of that elevator, Michelle did not recognize him, at least not right away. It wasn't until Jonathan Nice caught sight of Michelle and her father and walked quickly over to where they were standing that Michelle realized with a shock that the flushed, overweight, and balding middle-aged man standing right in front of her must be her future husband. 14 years later, on a snowy day in mid-January 2004, Michelle Rivera-Nice was standing alone in the state-of-the-art gym that her husband Jonathan had built for her inside of their million-dollar home in the pricey rural community of Titusville, New Jersey. Looking out one of the windows at the beautifully landscaped lawn, Michelle thought about the real cost of hiring Ostrich Nursery just over 3 years ago to plant the snow-covered trees that were now large enough to shade the 3-acre property. Michelle could still remember the first time she met the head of the Ostrich Nursery landscaping crew, Miguel de Jesus, the stocky and strong 34-year-old Puerto Rican who went by the nickname Enyo. He had knocked on the door of the Nice's 21-room, 3-story colonial-style house to give Michelle a summary and bill for the work that his crew had done so far. Michelle could also remember the instant attraction that she and Enyo felt for one another. But it would be another 9 months before Michelle and Enyo actually began the physical affair that had cost so much more than the $50,000 Jonathan had given his wife to get those trees planted. Michelle had not planned or expected to cheat on her husband Jonathan. In fact, until the last few years leading up to her meeting with Enyo, Michelle had thought overall her marriage had been pretty solid. Once Michelle had gotten over the shock she had felt when she first saw Jonathan in the lobby of the Las Palmas Hotel, she had still decided to go forward with their marriage. The real Jonathan may have looked older and less attractive than the picture he had sent her, but in the 7 days they had spent together after he arrived in the Philippines, Michelle believed that their feelings for one another were still the same. And after getting to know Jonathan and seeing how much he obviously adored their beautiful 20-year-old daughter, Michelle's parents had given the couple their blessing. And on Monday, June 11, 1990, about 1 year after Jonathan had answered Michelle's Lonely Hearts ad in the Manila Times newspaper, Jonathan and Michelle, looking radiant in a beautiful white gown Jonathan had bought for her, were married at a civil service in Michelle's hometown of Orion. After that, in the 7 months that it took Michelle to get the visa that would allow her to join Jonathan in the United States, Jonathan not only set up a generous bank account for Michelle, he also took a second job so he could send regular checks to Michelle's entire family. Jonathan had also come up with a cover story that he and Michelle would tell his family and colleagues when Michelle did appear by Jonathan's side at East Carolina University in the town of Greenville, where Jonathan was a professor. To avoid the embarrassment of Michelle being seen as a mail-order bride, the couple would explain that they had met and married in Hawaii while Jonathan had been away at a conference. And a little over 9 months to the day from Michelle's arrival stateside in April of 1991, the marriage between Michelle and Jonathan delivered on the promise they'd made each other to have a family together. In January 1992, the couple welcomed their first child, and 22 months after that, they welcomed their second son. And 6 years after that, they welcomed their third and final child, a daughter named Samantha. By then, local gossip over Michelle's youth and sudden appearance had died down, and she had been warmly accepted by Jonathan's friends and family. Jonathan had also delivered on the promise he'd made to Michelle that marriage to him would mean a life of financial comfort and stability, not only for Michelle, but for her family back in the Philippines. And by the end of 1998, a little over 9 years since their marriage, all of Jonathan's hard work and long hours at the lab catapulted the couple from the ranks of the financially comfortable into the ranks of the truly wealthy. That's when Jonathan's research into a cure for asthma grabbed the attention of the $4 billion asthma drug market, and Jonathan launched his own multi-million-dollar company called Epigenesis. 2 years later, by early 2000, the family had moved from their apartment in Greenville, North Carolina, to their huge house here at No. 1 Keithwood Court. But for Michelle, there had been a dark side to her husband's success. With each passing year of their marriage, Michelle had really begun to notice that Jonathan was becoming a more and more possessive and controlling partner. He had gone from being proud of being seen in public with his attractive young wife to feeling jealous when any other man so much as looked at her. After Michelle had joined a local gym and become interested in a career as a personal trainer, Jonathan had responded by building a gym inside their home, so Michelle, dressed in form-fitting clothes, would no longer have any reason to leave the house if she wanted to work out. And when Michelle went back to the Philippines to visit her family for the first time in 9 years, Jonathan had refused to let her take their children with her to see their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The landscaping project had been another one of Jonathan's efforts to control Michelle's growing restlessness, and also the loneliness and isolation she was feeling, because Jonathan was now spending so many long days working at Epigenesis. Jonathan had given her that $50,000 and told her to do whatever she wanted to make the property outside their house as beautiful as all the new furnishings had made the inside of their house. By the time Michelle picked up the phone and called Ostrich Landscaping, Michelle had also begun to suspect that despite their lavish lifestyle, Jonathan's company, Epigenesis, might not be doing as well as Jonathan kept saying it was. Despite his constant work and travel, investors were starting to lose confidence not only in the drug that Jonathan was developing, but also in Jonathan's performance as CEO of Epigenesis. Not to mention the fact that Jonathan had started drinking heavily. But even though these stresses and strains on their marriage had caused friction between Michelle and Jonathan, it wasn't until Michelle discovered what she thought of as a huge betrayal of trust that the nicest marriage really started to fall apart. That betrayal of trust was a lie that Jonathan had told her right at the beginning of their relationship. Because back in 1989, not only did Jonathan send Michelle a picture of himself that had been taken when he was much younger, he had also lied to Michelle when he told her he was just 34 years old. In fact, when Jonathan answered Michelle's ad in the Manila Times, he was not just 14 years older than his 20-year-old bride-to-be, he was actually 40, making him twice as old as Michelle, whose biggest concern about their relationship had been their age difference. And when Jonathan had filed all the paperwork required to make their marriage legal in both the United States as well as in the Philippines, Jonathan had also falsified his age. Having seen that doctored paperwork, it never occurred to Michelle to question Jonathan's age until more than a decade later when she and Jonathan's mother were talking about an upcoming birthday. When Michelle commented on Jonathan's age, her mother-in-law looked surprised and then dropped the bombshell that would turn what remained of Michelle's love for her husband into anger and resentment. In May of 2002, Jonathan would not be turning 44, he would be turning 52. To Jonathan, that lie he had told so many years ago might have seemed unimportant once he and Michelle had fallen in love and gotten married, but to Michelle, finding out about it 12 years later felt like a perfectly timed blow that would break open all the cracks in their marriage. When Michelle, aged 32, first met the handsome gardener, Enyo, the two of them talked together over coffee. After that landscaping project was finished, Michelle and Enyo, who had a common-law wife and 3 kids, exchanged phone numbers and talked by phone. But it wasn't until a few months after Michelle had found out that her husband had lied to her about how old he was, that Michelle made the step from having an emotional affair with a man whose life was even more complicated than her own to having a sexual affair. Now, 2 years after Michelle's first meeting with Enyo in a seedy, pay-by-the-hour motel room the next town over from Titusville, the Nice's stable and prosperous marriage and life was going down the drain. 1 year after the affair started, Jonathan, who had been suspicious about Michelle's sudden and frequent absences from the house, had checked her cell phone and discovered that his young wife was cheating on him. Enyo's wife had discovered the same thing and had kicked Enyo out of the house. After that, Jonathan went to the police claiming that he'd gotten a call from Enyo demanding $500,000 or Enyo would go public with a recording he had made of having sex with Michelle. Even though police couldn't prove Jonathan's claim, the investigation had turned the couple's lives upside down. There had been a confrontation between Enyo and Jonathan, who had taken out a year-long restraining order against Enyo that forbid Enyo from coming anywhere near Michelle or the nice home. There had been angry calls from Enyo's wife, and Enyo himself had begun asking Michelle for money. And then everything else had fallen apart too. Jonathan's new cure for asthma turned out to be a failure, and 10 months ago, in March 2003, the board of directors at Epigenesis had fired Jonathan and kicked him out of the company he had founded 9 years earlier. The board had given him a generous stipend, but it wasn't enough money to support the family's expensive lifestyle. And 4 months later, Michelle overrode her husband's objections and got a part-time job working 25 hours a week behind a cosmetics counter at the local mall. Jonathan himself was now spending almost all day at home, enjoying time with his 3 kids, and also watching Michelle, who was now actively talking about wanting a divorce, even as Jonathan was begging her to stay with him and work on their marriage. Now, letting out a deep sigh, Michelle took one last look through the window before turning away and leaving her workout room. The snow that had fallen the night before had been enough for area schools to close for the day, but Michelle knew that the mall was still open despite the weather. Glancing at her watch, Michelle saw that it was close to 4 p.m., time for her to shower, change into her black uniform, pin her brass Chanel name tag to her breast pocket, and head to her evening shift behind the Chanel counter at Macy's department store. A few minutes after 4, Michelle heard the sound of Jonathan's car in the driveway. He had taken the 3 kids out sledding, and now they were home just for a few minutes before heading off to Samantha's gymnastics class, just long enough for Michelle to say hello and goodbye to all 4 of them, and for Michelle to remind Jonathan that after work she'd be meeting up with a girlfriend at the mall, and then Jonathan and the kids all piled back into Jonathan's brand new big red Hummer and drove away. But even though snow seemed to be the only thing that set that Thursday afternoon apart from the dozens of other Thursdays that had come before, January 15th, 2004 was anything but usual for Michelle Nice. Because by the time Michelle walked out of the house that she and Jonathan could no longer afford and climbed into the Toyota Land Cruiser that they could also no longer afford, the mail-order bride from the tiny village in the Philippines had finally arrived at a decision about her marriage and her future. Putting the big green SUV in gear, Michelle headed out in the gathering darkness towards Quaker Bridge Mall, where she would clock into work at exactly 6:03 p.m. Along the way, Michelle kept checking her rearview mirror. It wasn't just the fights with Jonathan that had been keeping her on edge lately. As Michelle had recently told her close girlfriend, as well as her husband, Michelle had begun to suspect that when she did leave the house, there was someone out there who had begun keeping an eye on her. It wasn't until the maintenance crew from the local gas and electric company saw the dark green Toyota for the second time, still sitting with its front wheels partly submerged in Jacobs Creek, its engine still running, that they decided to stop. It was around 7 a.m. on Friday, January 16th, and the 2 men had spent the entire night working on electric poles and wires that had come down in the recent snowstorm. They'd first spotted the Land Cruiser an hour earlier on their way to get breakfast. Even though the SUV was parked 15 feet below the roadway, it was still easy to see, and with its engine on and front wheels standing at about 6 inches of water, the men had assumed that the vehicle must belong to a local hunter or someone who was out fishing. Now, breakfast finished and heading back to work, the men weren't so sure. And a few minutes later, after scrambling down the snowy embankment from their service truck to take a closer look at the Toyota, their curiosity and concern turned to horror. It wasn't just the frozen blood smeared on the outside of the vehicle and staining the snow next to the driver's side door. It was what the men saw when they looked through the driver's side car window that caused them to stumble backward and grab for their phones. Within minutes of the 911 call to the Hopewell Township Police Department, Jacobs Creek Road was swarming with emergency vehicles responding to the frantic report of a dead body found inside of the dark green Toyota Land Cruiser near an abandoned campsite down at the edge of Jacobs Creek. By the time Detective Daniel McEwen had arrived on the scene an hour later, the area was roped off with red accident tape, and medics had confirmed that the person inside the vehicle was in fact dead. Meanwhile, after finding out the license plate numbers, police also discovered that the car was registered to Jonathan and Michelle Nice, a wealthy couple who lived at No. 1 Keithwood Court, half a mile away. But as Detective McEwen climbed out of his parked car and slid down the slope to the accident scene, he had already recognized the dark green Toyota Land Cruiser. And when he looked inside the open driver's side door, the 40-year-old investigator could also instantly confirm the identity of the woman whose battered, bloody, and frozen body lay slumped over the center console. Because it was Detective McEwen who had handled the investigation 6 months earlier into Jonathan's claim that Michelle's lover, the gardener Enyo, had tried to extort $500,000 from the wealthy founder of the drug company Epigenesis. Now, as the detective looked at the mangled body of Michelle Rivera Nice, his first thought, hasn't this family been through enough?, was immediately followed by the realization that what he was looking at was not the result of a tragic car accident. Despite the red accident tape that was strung up around the vehicle, When the detective stepped back and looked around, he took in 3 key details that all pointed to a much darker and more disturbing cause of death. First, there was a set of footprints made by someone wearing large work boots that led away from the passenger side of the car and back up the embankment to Jacobs Creek Road. There was no sign of damage to the vehicle that would have been consistent with the driver losing control of the car and plunging down the 15-foot embankment or colliding with another vehicle. And then there was the position and condition of Michelle's body. The driver's seat where she sat, all 5 foot 2 inches of her, was pushed so far back from the steering wheel and floor pedals that it would have been impossible for her feet to reach the brake or accelerator. As for her injuries, it looked like Michelle's wounds were the result of blunt force trauma, not the result of a car crash. If Detective McEwen was right, it was possible that Michelle had actually been attacked somewhere else and then driven by her murderer here to this secondary crime scene where the murderer tried to make it appear that Michelle had been killed in a car accident. Even before investigators from the New Jersey State Police Major Crimes Unit arrived on the scene at 10:30 p.m. that Friday night to coordinate the investigation, Detective McEwen's past experience with the Nice family had made him the obvious choice for lead detective on this case within the local Hopewell Township Police Department. Operating now on the possibility that what they were looking at was a homicide and not an accident, the Hopewell Township Police had already switched gears into investigation mode. As soon as officers had informed Jonathan Nice that his wife had been in a car accident, they would have enough information from her husband about Michelle and where she had been the night before that they could start interviewing Michelle's friends and acquaintances, as well as her co-workers at the Quaker Bridge Mall, including the woman that Michelle had said she had plans to meet up with after her shift at the Macy's Chanel counter. But for Detective McEwen, who knew that the first 48 hours of a murder investigation were critical because that was when the most people were assigned to the case and also when there was the most publicity that might generate leads, his plan was to focus on the people who he already knew had intense and troubled connections with Michelle Nice. And at the top of that list was her husband, Jonathan. Although Detective McEwen had never been able to prove Jonathan's claim that he was the victim of an extortion scheme, Detective McEwen had learned a lot about the Nice family when he dug into that allegation 6 months earlier, back in July of 2003. At that time, Michelle had admitted to the detective that her husband was right when he'd accused her of having an affair with Miguel Enyo de Jesus, one of the crew leaders from the Ostrich Nursery. And the detective had seen firsthand the turmoil that affair had caused, the confrontation between Jonathan and Enyo, the fight over the restraining order against Enyo, the angry phone calls that Enyo's wife had made to Michelle. Michelle had also told the detective and Jonathan that she had ended the affair after Enyo had started asking Michelle for, quote, loans, end quote, and showing as much interest in her finances as he was showing in her. So, while crime scene techs continued to photograph and collect evidence at Jacobs Creek, and local officers fanned out to interview the Nice's neighbors, Detective McEwen and his partner hopped into their unmarked police car and headed out to No. 1 Keithwood Court to get a formal statement from Michelle's husband. And by 11:15 a.m., Jonathan, distraught and haggard, was ushered into the Hopewell police station and seated behind the desk that was right across from the desk where Detective McEwen and his partner sat. Jonathan had been told about Michelle's death before the investigators arrived. Dazed and confused, he had agreed to have a police officer stay at his home with his 3 kids so he could leave immediately with investigators. According to Jonathan, the last time he had seen Michelle was at 4 p.m. on Thursday afternoon when he had brought their 3 kids home from sledding for a few minutes before heading right back out to gymnastics. When they left the house, Michelle was getting ready for work, and she had told Jonathan that after her shift ended at 8 p.m., she was going to meet up with a girlfriend. After the kids ate dinner, Jonathan made a call to Michelle that went straight through to voicemail, and he and the children all left a message saying goodnight, and then all 4 of them, Jonathan and his 3 kids, watched a movie together and fell asleep in Jonathan's bed. Jonathan told police it was about midnight when he woke up again and realized that Michelle was still not home. When he dialed her number, his call went straight to voicemail again. With a meaningful look at Detective McEwen, Jonathan explained that despite Michelle's earlier claim that she had ended her affair with Enyo, Jonathan suspected she was still cheating on him. So even though it was unusual for Michelle to stay out this late, Jonathan wasn't surprised. He assumed she must be with one of her lovers, which would also explain why she still was not home that morning. So instead of trying to find Michelle, Jonathan only stayed up long enough to take an anti-anxiety medication prescribed by his doctor, hoping just to calm himself down. Not only could the three nice children, aged 12, 10, and 5, confirm that their dad was at the house with them last night, and that they all slept together in Jonathan's bed, Jonathan also told the detectives that if Michelle had died under suspicious circumstances, the person they should be talking with was Enyo. And here, the research scientist reminded Detective McEwen about Enyo's extortion demand the previous summer for $500,000. Before getting a ride home from the police station, Jonathan also told police that lately, Michelle had begun complaining that she was being followed when she was out in town, maybe by Enyo or one of the gardener's friends, his wife, or maybe another family member. Rubbing at his shadowed eyes, Jonathan said that he wished now that he had taken her concern more seriously. And by midday Saturday, Detective McEwen and every other officer assigned to the Michelle Nice investigation were also feeling a new sense of urgency, because the medical examiner's report, issued at 4 p.m. on the 17th, had confirmed that Michelle Nice had been murdered, and that the cause of death had been a savage beating. 2 hours after that report was issued, the other prime suspect on Detective McEwen's list, Miguel Enyo de Jesus, accompanied by his attorney, walked into the Hopewell Township Police Department. During the extortion investigation the previous summer, Detective McEwen hadn't just found out a lot about Michelle and Jonathan Nice, he'd also found out a lot about Enyo. Like the fact that the gardener used several different names and social security numbers in an effort to avoid paying court-ordered child support to a family from an earlier relationship. The detective had used those various aliases to finally track Enyo down at an apartment he was sharing in Cranberry, New Jersey with his common-law wife, Patricia, 40 minutes east of where the Nice family lived. But it wasn't until Enyo had lawyered up that he was willing to speak with investigators. And with that lawyer sitting next to him, Enyo made a series of admissions that would put him squarely in police crosshairs. According to Enyo, he and Michelle had resumed their affair just 2 months after Michelle had told her husband that the affair was over, and while Enyo was still subject to the restraining order to keep away from the Nice family. Enyo also admitted that he had met up with Michelle on Thursday night before she was killed, when the couple had rented a cheap motel room for 2 hours. But Enyo, like Jonathan Nice, also had an alibi. According to the gardener, after they had checked out of Mount Motel, Enyo had driven Michelle back to the Quaker Bridge Mall and kissed her goodnight at 12:30 a.m., just as Thursday night clicked over into Friday morning. Then, in an effort to hide where he'd been from his wife Patricia, Enyo said he met up with a friend at a bar 40 minutes from Michelle's home before heading to his own house at 1:15 a.m., where his wife was awake and waiting for him. But even as officers prepared to test every minute of Enyo's alibi, the investigation into Michelle's death was about to go in a whole new direction, because Detective McEwen had found himself circling back to a comment that Michelle's husband had made almost 2 days earlier. The detective did not know it at the time, but that comment would end up being the key to solving Michelle's brutal murder. And by Sunday, January 18th, just 72 hours after Hopewell Township Police had received the 911 call reporting the discovery of her body down at Jacobs Creek, investigators had identified and were preparing to arrest Michelle's murderer. Based on what police discovered when they followed up on Jonathan's offhand remark to Detective McEwen about Michelle's last day alive, here is a reconstruction of what really happened on the night that Michelle was killed. By the time Michelle had dragged her suitcase out of her house and into the attached garage of No. 1 Keithwood Court, it was after 1 a.m. in the very early morning of Friday, January 16th, and Michelle had said everything she needed to say to her killer. She had made her decision. It was just like she had told her closest friends. She was tired of the arguments, the guilt, and the demands. Still dressed in her black work outfit with the Chanel name tag pinned to her blouse, Michelle slipped off her shoes so she would make as little noise as possible. She could only hope that her children had not heard anything that had happened during the last 30 minutes since she'd arrived home from the Quaker Bridge Mall. Looking at the bulging suitcase, Michelle realized that getting it into the back seat of the Land Cruiser would take time that she didn't have. Better to leave it, so now, moving quickly, she stepped up to the driver's side of the car, opened that door, and climbed in behind the wheel. The garage was dark, except for the interior car light. The garage door was closed, and the overhead lights were not on. But before Michelle had time to close the driver's side door and turn on the car engine, her killer had suddenly stepped forward out of the gloom, and the nightmare that would later be detailed in the medical examiner's autopsy report was about to begin. Reaching in through the open car door, Michelle's killer grabbed her arm. Squeezing hard enough to leave a fingerprint pattern of bruises, the killer dragged the 100-pound woman out of the seat and threw her onto the floor. As Michelle tried to scramble back to her feet, the killer reached behind her and pulled a baseball bat from a nearby utility shelf. As Michelle turned to get away, her killer wound up and swung the bat with all their might, hitting Michelle squarely in the back of her skull. Falling to the floor of the garage, Michelle's head struck the running board of the Land Cruiser, leaving a dark splash of blood that dripped down onto the ground. Even though the medical examiner would later determine that the strike from the baseball bat had fractured Michelle's skull from the top of her eye socket to the base of her neck, at that point, the mother of three still gathered herself for a fight, trying to cover her face with her hands before turning over and dragging herself back to her feet. But Michelle, barefoot now except for her stockings, only made it a few steps towards the door before sliding in her own blood. As she started to go down onto her hands and knees, the killer came up on her from behind, and grabbing her shoulders, the killer immediately began to slam Michelle's face and head into the concrete floor of the garage again and again, only stopping after hearing what they later described as a sickening thud of smashed bone and cartilage. According to the medical examiner, Michelle's attempt to fight off her attacker had left her with cuts and bruises on her hands, wrists, and lips. The beating had not only cracked her skull, it had also caused significant internal organ damage, as well as bruising and injuries on her arms, hips, and elbows. But as Michelle's murderer slowly stood up, breathing hard and looking around the dim interior of the garage, the medical examiner would later estimate that it may have taken as much as 10 minutes before Michelle finally choked to death on her own blood. In that time, the killer thought through the next steps. Leaning down again to check for a pulse that was no longer there, a jolt of adrenaline surged through the killer. Gathering up Michelle's small body, the killer pushed her into the driver's seat of the Land Cruiser. Then the killer grabbed Michelle's blood-spattered suitcase, shoving it onto the back seat of the Toyota. Oblivious to the biting cold, at 2:15 a.m. on Friday morning, the killer circled the big green SUV and climbed into the passenger seat. Reaching over and starting up the engine, the killer gripped the steering wheel with one hand and used the other to click open the garage door. Then, awkwardly, making sure the headlights were turned off and using the long handle of an ice scraper to push the pedals of the accelerator and brake, the killer put the car into reverse and began backing out of the garage. Once the killer had enough room in the driveway to turn the car around, they immediately lost control of the vehicle, veering off the driveway and onto the front garden before finally coming to a stop back on the driveway. With the car now in park, the killer leaned over the center console and pushed the driver's seat back as far as it would go so there was more room to manipulate the floor controls with the handle of this ice scraper. Or, as police believe, for the killer to climb into the driver's seat and drive the car while sitting literally on the lap of Michelle's bloody and lifeless body. A few minutes later, the killer was driving slowly along the narrow, dark stretch of Jacobs Creek Road, looking for the white picket fence that was the one break in the guardrail that separated the road from the embankment leading down to Jacobs Creek. Once the killer saw the white wooden fence, they slowed, then steered the car so it broke and then ran over the fence. A moment later, and the big car had dropped gently down the 15-foot slope, passed through the middle of the small campsite, and broken the surface ice of the creek before the front wheels came to rest in 6 inches of water. 14 years earlier, when Michelle had met her future husband for the first time in person in the lobby of the Las Palmas Hotel, the one feature she had recognized from the photograph he had sent her of a much younger version of himself was his height. Now, after looking at his wife's dead body slumped over in the seat next to him, her right eye swollen shut, and the white bone of her skull showing through the cuts on her forehead, Jonathan Nice opened the passenger side of the family Land Cruiser and unfolded his heavy 6-foot 4-inch frame from the car as he stepped out onto the smooth expanse of unbroken snow. It was 3:15 a.m. Jonathan had been waiting for Michelle when she arrived home 2.5 hours earlier. As soon as her car had pulled into the garage, Jonathan had used the remote to close the garage door before beginning what was by now a familiar and vicious argument about Michelle's ongoing affair with Ennio. This time, though, Michelle didn't just tell her husband that she wanted a divorce, something she'd been saying for almost 5 months. This time, Michelle had walked into their bedroom, pulled out a suitcase, and begun packing to leave. For a long time now, Michelle had suspected that Jonathan had hired someone to follow her or was following her himself. Michelle had also come to believe, after finding a condom inside one of Jonathan's travel bags, that she wasn't the only one in this marriage who was being unfaithful. Now, Jonathan turned so he was facing the embankment, and wearing a pair of shoes he had constructed himself by gluing size 12 work boot soles onto the uppers of a pair of comfortable moccasins, he left the car and trudged through the snow back up to Jacobs Creek Road. From there, dressed in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, he walked the mile back to the house on Keithwood Court, where he spent the next few hours covering his tracks. He dumped some of his bloody clothes and towels he'd used to clean the garage floor into the washing machine to soak, turning the water in the tub pink. He filled white plastic trash bags with the blood-soaked paper towels he also used to clean the floor and walls before spot painting areas of the garage to cover blood spatter. He stuffed his wet black PJ bottoms behind the couch and then used a saw to cut the soles of his shoes away from the moccasin uppers before cutting the soles into small pieces and hiding them throughout the house. And he left the baseball bat, still stained with Michelle's blood, on the storage shelf where he had grabbed it a few hours earlier. And then, Michelle's husband and killer went upstairs and crawled back into bed with his 3 kids and waited for the call that would tell him that Michelle had been killed in a tragic car accident out on Jacob Creek Road. It would turn out that from the moment Detective McEwen and his partner arrived at No. 1 Keithwood Court on the morning that Michelle's body had been discovered and saw the crazy tire tracks in the snow on the Nice driveway, the detective had suspected that Jonathan Nice must be involved in Michelle's murder. Ever since meeting the Nice family back in July of 2003, the detective had been convinced that Jonathan's extortion claim against Ennio, along with Jonathan's claim that Ennio had threatened to hurt Michelle, were completely unfounded. And in conducting interviews back in the summer and again now that Michelle was dead, what he kept hearing from people close to Michelle was that Jonathan's lies about his age and his escalating attempts to control his younger wife, coupled with Michelle's resentment and restlessness, had turned the couple's marriage into a volatile stew of jealousy and, finally, uncontrolled rage. But despite these suspicions, it wasn't until Jonathan contradicted the formal statement he had given police that Detective McEwen had the grounds he needed to get a warrant that would allow police to search the Nice home for physical evidence that would tie Jonathan to his wife's murder. That moment came when Jonathan, riding with the detective back to the Nice home after Jonathan had sworn to police that the last time he had seen his wife was at 4 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, broke the silence inside the police car and told Detective McEwen somewhat offhandedly that until Jonathan and Michelle had fought later on the night when Michelle got back from work, Jonathan had really believed that the couple could make their marriage work. So, even as local police were out on Saturday tracking down and then interviewing Michelle's lover, Ennio, members of a special 13-member joint task force of state and local law enforcement, armed with a search warrant, were entering No. 1 Keithwood Court, where, over the next 3 days, they would find one incriminating piece of evidence after another. On Sunday, January 18, 2004, 2.5 days after the discovery of Michelle's body, Jonathan was brought into the Hopewell police station for a second interview, during which the 54-year-old scientist confessed to the murder of his 34-year-old wife. Jonathan would go on to say that he acted in self-defense after Michelle, who was 1 foot shorter than her husband and weighed 100 pounds compared to his 240 pounds, had threatened him with either a stiletto knife or the heel of one of her high-heeled shoes. The jury that found Jonathan Nice guilty of passion, provocation, manslaughter 19 months later did not buy that story, but they did reject the prosecution's claim that Michelle's death was premeditated. In September of 2005, Jonathan Nice was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 5 years later, he was released and returned to his kids, who had been placed in the care of Jonathan's brother and sister-in-law. In 2012, 8 years after Michelle's murder, Jonathan founded a successful new company that sold drugs claiming to cure the symptoms of cancer in dogs. But 8 years later, in one final twist to a story that had caused a national sensation back in 2004, a federal investigation proved that Jonathan's so-called cancer-curing drugs were a fraud, and that Jonathan's company was nothing more than a money-making scheme that had netted more than $1 million. And on Friday, December 23, 2022, 18 years after murdering his wife Michelle, Jonathan Nice was convicted by a federal grand jury of wire fraud and the interstate shipment of misbranded animal drugs. As of June 2023, the 73-year-old scientist now faces a large fine and up to 32 more years in prison. In 2006, Dave Murphy had just become a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was as a protective service officer, which meant he'd be in charge of physical security in a number of the county facilities. Dave's first facility was the Capital City Theater, which is a landmark inside of Salt Lake City. It's been around since the early 1900s. It's this beautiful, grand theater. So in early August, Dave reports to the Capital City Theater for his first day on the job, and he meets his partner, an officer by the name of Morgan Matthews. He gets there on this first day, and right away, Dave would say that Morgan was just strictly business. The first place that Morgan takes Dave is the control room, which sits on the first floor of the theater. The theater had 3 floors, and then it also had a basement as well. So the control room was on that first floor. Inside of the control room were all of the security monitors, because there was all these cameras set up inside of the theater. The cameras weren't great though. You pretty much could only tell what was in frame if there was a light on, and most of the time at night especially, lights were off. Once they were done looking at the control room, Morgan says to Dave, now we're gonna go do our rounds. This is something we do every time you get to the theater. You do a security round and make sure everything's locked, all the lights are off. Before you come back to the control room, you'll do that at the beginning of your shift and at the end of your shift. Morgan brings Dave downstairs, and it's the first time Dave is seeing the basement, and he's shocked by how big it is. It is this massive hallway that stretches way down. In the middle of the hall is a piano that's just sitting out in the middle, and the lighting's not good down there. This is a very old theater. Everything in the building was pretty old. And Dave remembers thinking that he was immediately creeped out by this scene, this long hallway with all these doors and this piano right in the middle of the hallway. And he's thinking to himself, I don't want to spend much time down here. This is so creepy. But they go down the hall, they check all the doors, they make their way up to the main floor, the second floor, the third floor, everything gets checked. And so after they do this security round, Dave and Morgan go back to the control room, and Dave is anticipating getting to know Morgan a little bit. This is their first night. They're going to be working together a lot. And Dave would say that Morgan just seemed really cold and just did not want to talk to Dave very much. And as soon as their shift was almost over, Morgan was very eager to just knock out the security rounds and just get out of that building. At the end of that night, Dave remembers thinking that there's just something off about Morgan's behavior. It seemed like Morgan really didn't like being in the theater. And it would turn out that he was onto something, because Morgan didn't like being in that building. But it would take him a while to share with Dave why. Over the next couple of days, Morgan and Dave would do their security rounds together, because Dave's in training, Morgan's teaching him. But on August 9th, which is 2 days after Dave's first day on the job, Morgan was confident that Dave knew how to secure the whole building. And so at the end of the night, he tells Dave, why don't you do the security rounds yourself? Dave feels very confident that he knows how to do it. He goes down into the basement, makes sure all the doors are shut and locked, that the lights are off. finishes the basement, goes up to the first floor where the control room is and checks all the rooms on that floor. He goes into the main auditorium space. He's checking all the different nooks and crannies to make sure there's nobody hiding in there. He goes up to the second floor. He checks all the different rooms up there and the balcony, makes his way up to the third floor where there's all the offices of staff that work at the theater. At the end of the search, the last room he would check was the rehearsal room. And it was the only room where there was no door to it. So you'd poke your head in, kind of look around, make sure no one was in there, and then you would leave, and that's the end of your check. So Dave gets to the rehearsal room, he flips the light on, and he looks inside, doesn't see anybody, is satisfied that no one's in there, turns the light off, and as he's about to turn back into the hallway, he hears a door slam with tremendous force right across the hallway from where he was, and it was the bathroom door. And his first reaction is someone just ran out of the bathroom. Someone who had snuck into the building must have run out of the bathroom and they're making a break for it to get out of the theater before I catch them. And so he instinctively picks up his radio and he calls to Morgan and says, someone's on the third floor. But when Morgan looks at the camera, he doesn't see anybody. At this point, Dave's drawn his weapon, and he's looking down the hall. He doesn't see anybody. And as he's waiting for Morgan to come upstairs to back him up so they can go look for this person that's just ran down the hall, he realizes two things. One, just because he heard the door slam doesn't mean they left and slammed it. They could be in the bathroom. And so he's thinking to himself, someone could be in the bathroom right now. Maybe that's why we didn't see him on the camera. And then the second thing he thought of is that door, the bathroom door, can't slam. It's got this huge hydraulic hinge to it. It can't slam. So his gun is drawn and he's aiming it at the bathroom door right as Morgan comes up on his right. Morgan draws his pistol. He's got it on the door as well. And they make entry into the bathroom. They clear all the different spaces in the bathroom and no one's in there. And there's no way to get out of there. Morgan and Dave are like, okay, well, they must not have come in here. They must have run out of the bathroom. They're somewhere in the theater. And so they decide they're going to search the entire building and find this person that clearly was just in the bathroom. And that's how they slammed the door. We're not going to worry about how they slammed the door with the hydraulic hinge. We just know it was slammed somehow. So they leave the bathroom, guns still drawn, and they start making their way down the hall. They're checking all the doors, everything is locked. When they start making their way downstairs to the second floor, Dave recognizes through the door, because there's a door leading onto the second floor, he can see that the lights are on, and he had turned them off. And so as they're walking down the stairs, he says to Morgan, hey, did you turn the lights on the second floor? And Morgan's like, no. And so they think that whoever was here, whoever was in the bathroom is on the second floor. They must have turned the lights on. They go into the second floor, and not only are the lights on, but all the doors on the second floor had been opened. They search the entire second floor. They search every single room. No one's on the second floor. They turn off the lights. They shut all the doors. Everything's locked. When they went down to the first floor, everything was the way it should have been. Locked, lights off, nothing down there. And they go down to the basement. And even though it was creepy being down there because they've now searched the whole building and they're anticipating coming in contact with whoever is here, assuming they haven't left the building yet. And there's no one down there. They decided to review the footage from the third floor to see if they could pick up someone running in the hall around the time that door slammed. But the camera was not trained on the bathroom door. So you just have this view down the hall. You can't see the bathroom specifically, not to mention the hallway is dark and the cameras are terrible without light. And so all they're able to see is the light go on in the rehearsal room while Dave is doing his last check in there. The lights turn off because Dave's about to turn around. And then after that, you just hear this massive slam of this door, but you can't see what happened. So they don't know what to make of it. They're both very much on edge that someone might still be in the building. And so they do another sweep of the building and no one's there. And so they decide to just chalk it up and say, we were hearing things and seeing things. I'm sure it's fine. Let's just get out of here. And they leave. A couple of days later, on August 11th, Morgan is working alone. Dave wasn't coming in that day, so Morgan's alone in the theater doing a shift. And at some point in the night, as he's sitting in the control room, he thinks he hears whispering in the hall right behind him. And so after the experience he had with Dave a couple nights ago, he's on edge. So he draws his pistol right away. And so he goes out into the hallway, and immediately when he steps into the hall, the whispering seems to go farther and farther away from him down the hall. So he gets out there, he's looking around, he can't see anything. He makes his way down the hallway towards the stairs that go down into the basement, or if he wanted to go up to the second floor. And when he gets to the top of the stairwell, he's gun drawn, looking down, looking up. He hears what sounds like coughing coming from the basement. And at this point, Morgan said that he was actually pretty scared. I mean, imagine being alone in this theater just a couple of days earlier, you've had this weird experience with slamming doors and doors being opened and lights going on that somebody else, another police officer, witnessed with you. You're alone in this theater and you're hearing coughing coming from the basement after hearing voices behind you. That's pretty terrifying. So he very slowly starts going down the stairwell. He's getting ready to clear the corner, and just as he does, the coughing stops. He turns the lights on and he looks down the hall and there's nothing there. He starts making his way down the hall. He's checking every door, making sure it's locked, making sure that everything is secure. And he gets all the way down the hall. And as he's almost done checking the basement, he smells smoke, and it's coming from a door right next to him. And so he unlocks that door and he goes in, and there's no fire. But all he can smell is smoke. So he turns the light on. He's looking around. There's no fire. He's convinced that somewhere down in the basement there's a fire. He goes to every single room and he keeps checking, and there's nothing. And then at some point the smoke smell dissipates. He checks every space in the theater to look for a fire, and there's no fire. He's wondering if he should call the fire department, but he's thinking, what would I tell them? There's no fire. And so he ultimately, after checking 3-4 times and being very confident there wasn't a fire, he just says, okay, no fire. I guess I was just smelling things. A few weeks later, on September 4th, Dave has just arrived at the theater. He's there a little bit early. Their shift started at 5 p.m. He was there at about 4:30. And when he walked into the building, he sees that there are 3 staff members sitting at the front desk talking to each other. And as he walks past, one of them is talking about ghosts inside of the theater. And it immediately piques his interest. And so he walked over to the guy talking about ghosts and he introduced himself. And it turned out that this guy was a man named Blair Fuller, who was a senior accountant at the theater. And so Dave asked Blair, what are you talking about with ghosts in the theater? Because I provide physical security here and I've seen some strange things here. I'd just love to hear what you have to say about it. So they head up to the 3rd floor where Blair's office was, and they sit down, and Blair says, okay, I got a doozy for you. This happened to me a couple years ago. I was actually in this office. It was about 9-10 o'clock at night. I was doing some work and I heard the elevator kick on. Now, the elevator was right outside of his office, and anytime it was on, the engine was really loud. It was really obvious if the elevator was moving around. And so he's doing his accounting work and he hears that engine kick on. He doesn't think much of it, but then it clicks that he's the only one in the building. And so he kind of looks out the glass window of his office. He had a closed door office with 2 windows looking out into the foyer where there's this elevator, and he looks out and he can see that the little lights above the elevator showing what floor it's on have lit up and it's going up. So the elevator was in the basement and now it's in the 1st floor, the 2nd floor, 3rd floor. The door's open and there's no one there. And at this point, Blair says that he wasn't concerned. He figured, okay, maybe there's some maintenance, maybe it's scheduled to do that, who knows? But after a little while, the alarm goes off in the elevator to signify that something is obstructing the door from shutting. And he's like, there's nothing obstructing the door. Why isn't it shutting? And so he leaves his office and he kind of walks over to the elevator and he walks into the elevator. And he said immediately he felt this massive drop in temperature inside of the elevator. And as he's standing there, he turns around. Now he's looking back towards his office inside of the elevator. The doors start to shut. And for whatever reason, he said, I didn't get off. I just decided I'm going to ride this elevator. The basement button lights up as if someone had pressed basement, and they start going down. And he's sitting there thinking, what in the world is going on? It was just on an alarm because the door wasn't shutting. And then miraculously, when I go inside of it, it suddenly works again and it's going to the basement. So he goes to the basement, the door opens, no one there. He steps out and Blair says that it took all of his courage to yell out, hey, is anyone down here? And as soon as he did and he didn't hear a response, he said he didn't want to make any more sound. The elevator sat in the middle of the hall in the basement. It's that huge hall with that piano sitting right in the middle. The lights are off. And he pokes his head down one way. There's nothing down there. He sees the piano barely from the light of the elevator. And he looks down the other way. There's no one there. And at this point, he's just so spooked. He just gets back in the elevator and he hits floor 3, floor 3, floor 3. And he's hitting like door close, door close, door close. The door closes and he goes back up to his office. He goes into his office and he shuts the door and he sits down and he's thinking like, what was that? Why did that just happen? I got to find out. They're running maintenance or something. And as he's sitting in his chair thinking about this strange experience, he hears what sounds like banging sounds coming from outside of his office in that foyer near the elevator. He just goes to his door and he opens it up and he pokes his head into the foyer and he looks to the side and there's this big filing cabinet and all of the cabinets are out. They've all been pulled out. He certainly didn't do this. And it was as if someone was one by one pushing each of them shut, these big heavy cabinets. And he's watching as one by one these things are slamming shut. one by one until the whole thing is shut. And so he goes over and he's like trying to disprove what he just saw, that he can open up a drawer and that it will shut on its own. But none of them shut on their own. You have to shut it. Something has to shut it for it to shut. And so he packed up for the day and left and did not work another night shift at the theater. Later that night, Dave would share Blair's story with Morgan. He wasn't really sure how Morgan was going to react, but Morgan actually would open up and he would say, you know, before you started working here, I always felt like I was being watched when I was here. And then we had that experience, obviously, where the lights are coming on and you heard that banging from that bathroom door. And then just a few days ago, I heard voices coming from the hall and I heard someone coughing in the basement and I smelled smoke and there was no one there. And so they start going back and forth, exchanging stories of just how uncomfortable this place made them feel. And so they're wondering what they should do about this. And Dave has this idea. He's like, my best friend, I'll invite him to come over here one night and we'll tell him that we're giving him a tour of the building and we'll just see what he says. We'll see if he reacts to anything here. Who knows? You know, maybe something strange will happen and then we'll have another person validate it. Morgan thinks that's a good idea. And so Dave reaches out to his best friend, Greg. Greg would say that he was a little bit surprised to be getting this offer to come take a tour of the theater, but he was interested, and since Dave was asking, he figured he would oblige him, and so Greg agrees to come to the theater and take a tour. So the next day, Dave and Morgan are at the theater, and Greg shows up, and so they start this tour. They go in the main auditorium, they're looking around, and then they make their way into the basement. Morgan turns on the light. And Morgan and Dave instantly see a little ways down the hall on the left, one of the doors has been opened. And so Dave and Morgan push Greg out of the way. They draw their pistols and they're aimed at the open door. And so Greg just stays behind them as Morgan and Dave make their way down to this open door. And when they get right outside the door and they're about to push it open to go inside, the door slams shut right in front of Greg and Dave and Morgan. And they all are looking at each other like, what's going on? But before they can do anything, the door handle starts rattling really aggressively. After the rattling stops, Dave and Morgan look at each other and they nod their head like, we got to go in there. Greg is scared about being out in the hall alone, and so he just follows them in. And so the three of them go into this room. Dave and Morgan are, pistols drawn. It's a small room. There's no one in there. Light switch on, no one in there. Greg suddenly gasps and he points to the corner and he says, someone's sitting in the corner. And Dave and Morgan immediately train their guns on what's in the corner, but no one's there. And Greg's like, I just saw someone sitting in the corner. It looked like he had a hood on, he had like a sweatshirt on, I don't know, but he was right there. And so Dave and Morgan, they're freaked out because they brought Greg here on some level to disprove the strangeness. And now the three of them have seen a door slam that shouldn't have been open in the first place. Greg's claiming to have seen a figure sitting in the corner. This scared the crap out of all three of them. They quickly left, locked, shut off the lights, went upstairs. Greg's like, I'm out of here. Greg leaves. And Dave and Morgan are like, now what? So at this point, all the strangeness that was happening in the theater was getting reported, but it was being reported in a way that Dave and Morgan didn't seem like they were referencing something haunted, but rather someone was breaking in. Ultimately, the county installed new cameras inside of the theater. These updated cameras had infrared technology, which allowed them to see better when the lights were off. They were hoping that this would allow them to catch whoever was breaking in practically every time Dave and Morgan are on shift. So on the day that it was installed, September 15th, Morgan is working there alone. And he's sitting in the control room looking at the different cameras, and he's kind of playing around with the different screens and seeing what each of the cameras can do. And at some point, something catches his eye in one of the screens. In the main auditorium, it appeared like someone might be sitting in one of the seats, but the camera was zoomed back enough that he couldn't get a clear picture, and he didn't know what was normal in any of these cameras, because this is the first time he's looking at any of these screens. And so he's looking at the camera really closely, and he thinks he sees someone, he can't really tell, that has a hood on or a shroud on that's just sitting in the middle of the theater. And he can see clear as day a set of eyes. And before Morgan has a chance to do it, it just starts raising into the ceiling and disappears. Morgan didn't even check to see what it was. He was done. He literally quit that day. That was his last day at the theater. A couple of weeks after Morgan has quit and Dave is working alone at the theater, he's in the control room, and all of a sudden he hears a piano playing. And there's only one piano in the entire theater, and it's sitting in the basement. It's his job to protect this place, so he knows he has to go down and check because it could be some hooligan in the building somewhere. So he leaves the control room, and as he starts walking over to the stairs with his gun drawn, the music is getting louder and louder. The piano is getting louder and louder and louder. He makes his way down the steps, and as he's about to turn the corner, he hears the guard that protects the keys on the piano slam shut, and the piano stops. Then he turns around the corner and he looks, and there's no one down there. He flips on the light, no one's in the hall. He knows he's not going to find anyone down here. It's this entity that's causing all this mayhem inside of the theater. Dave's seen enough. He's done. He's done with this theater, and he goes right back upstairs. He goes in the control room, locks it, stays there till the end of his shift, and then he is out. And the next day, he goes to his sergeant and he says, "You can't ever put me back inside that theater or I will quit." And so sure enough, he was transferred. Over the next 2 months, they didn't have anyone who could do full-time security at the theater. So different random officers would be there for a couple hours, a couple of days a week, until November 26th. They found another officer, a veteran police officer named Josh Thomas, who was going to be working at the theater full-time. On November 26th, the first night that Josh Thomas was going to be there, he didn't have anyone to turn over with, so he was just alone at the theater. And it just so happens that Dave is in a patrol car near the theater. And when at some point in the night, Josh comes over the radio and says, "Hey, I need backup right now. Someone has broken into the theater." Dave knows that it's probably not someone breaking in. He knows what's going on inside that theater. He was the closest to it. And even though he did not want to go, he felt like it was his responsibility to go to that theater and be Josh's backup. And if it was what Dave thought it would be, this entity in the theater, that he would be able to explain to him what he had seen before he ultimately decided never to go back. And when Dave gets to the theater, there's this back door that they would go into, and he sees Josh is standing just outside the theater. And Dave would say that Josh's eyes were, like saucers. He looked terrified. And so Dave has an inkling of what's going on, and he goes over to Josh and he's like, "What's going on? Is someone still in there?" He said that he had been doing security rounds and he had heard what sounded like voices when he was in the basement, and he didn't think much of it. He checked all the rooms, everything was shut. And when he made his way up to the 3rd floor, he saw that the elevator had kicked on. It was in the basement, and suddenly the light was on and it was roaring up to the 3rd floor. And when the elevator opened up, there was no one there. And he's standing there looking at it, and he looks inside, there's no one there, and then the alarm goes off. That's when he called in for backup. Dave says, "Look, let's just go search the building, we'll do it together." They clear the whole theater, no one's there. And before Dave leaves, they go into the main auditorium where the stage is, and they're just standing on the stage chatting with each other. And Dave, his back is to where the audience would be. And Josh is facing Dave, facing towards the seats. Josh just suddenly stopped. Mid-sentence, he's just frozen and looking just beyond Dave's shoulder. And Dave goes, "What?" And Josh goes, "There's something behind you." Dave slowly turns around, and as soon as he does, he can tell immediately what Josh is looking at. Standing in the very back of the theater away from them is a man standing in the corner with its hands by its sides. Its back is to them, and it's looking down with a hood over its head. Dave turns his whole body around to look at this thing right as this thing turns around real quick and looks directly at them. It has these deep, dark, sunken eyes, and its face looks like it had been very badly burned, like it was black and charred. And it's looking at them before it just turns and runs out the back of the theater. Josh believed that that was an intruder. Dave was fairly certain that that was just another example of this entity that haunts the theater. But they would search the building and they could never find that cloaked figure again. And that was when Dave sat Josh down in the control room and he filled him in on why Morgan had quit and why he ultimately had quit. And he also told him the story from Blair. So Josh is like, "Great, I'm glad I work here now." This was the last time that Dave would go to the theater. But Dave would do some additional digging on the history of the theater. It would turn out that in the 40s, there was this horrible fire, and a man had been trapped in the basement when the fire had erupted, and he had died inside of the theater. And so Dave would share this information with Morgan and with Josh, and the three of them all believed that what they were witnessing was the ghost of that man who died in that fire. "911 dispatchers hear a lot of interesting stories coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat?" It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency, it just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back, and eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, "John, where are you? John, John." By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through, and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her, like they always did, "This is 911, you can't call here, you need to talk to your family." And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared. "John, please come home, help me, I need help, John, come home." This time, they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her and she's not coming to the door and it's all quiet in the house. The door is unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her, and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms and no one's there until they get to the last room, and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, "Hey, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her. Because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made." But the dispatchers are like, "No way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her." What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property, they knock on the door, no one's inside, the door is actually still open, they go in, the house is empty, there's no one there, there's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help. "I need my husband." And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore, and there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed. And he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her. Even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year